B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Yevamot Daf Chof. We're going to start from the Mishnah, 15 lines from the top of the Omid. Says the Mishnah, Klal Omru b'Yevamah. There's a rule in Yibum that Kol shehi Isur Erva, that if there is an Isur Erva, which means that if Shimon died and he had a couple of wives, and one of his wives was an Erva to Reuven, the surviving brother, then even though there's a mitzvah for Reuven to do Yibum, to marry one of Shimon's widows, but he cannot marry the Erva. He cannot do Yibum to the Erva, as we've learnt extensively in the Masechet till now. But not only that, not only the Erva itself, but any other rival wife of that Erva, any other wife of Shimon, anyone who Shimon was married to when he passed away, then also that's called a tzara, also does not do Yibum or Chalitza. Kol shehi Isser Erva loy chiletzes v'loy misyabemes. The Erva herself or the Tzoras Erva do not do Yibum or Chalitza. That's as far as the Erva, which is we've learnt in the Mishnah in the beginning of the Masechta, the 15 serious aroyos by Yibum. However, there are some more lenient type of Ervas, similar to Ervas, but not really the chorus Ervas, and there's two brackets. There's the bracket of Isurim Derabonon and the bracket of Isurim D'Oraisa, but not krisis. For example, those who are osa because it's an Isser Aseh or because it's a Lois Aseh, but not chorus. So the Mishnah says Isur Mitzvah. We'll soon see exactly what that means. But the Isur Mitzvah, which the Mishnah is going to explain, means the Aroyes Midirabonon, or the Isur Kedusha, which is the Aroyes which are Chayve Lavin, not Chayve Krisois. In those cases, Choyletzes V'loy Misyabemes. They cannot do Yibum, but however, the severity of the issue is not enough to exempt them altogether from the whole subject of Yibum, and therefore they have to do Chalitza. Continues the Mishnah, Achoisa shehi Yevimta. If you have two sisters, and two sisters who married two brothers, and then the two brothers that were married to the two sisters passed away without children, now to the other surviving brothers, you've now got two sisters who are Neifel Yibum, who they have a mitzvah to do Yibum with. Now, if one of these two sisters are an erva to one of the surviving brothers, then that sister is not in the whole context of Yibum. She's not what we call Neifel Yibum. For example, if you had Reuven and Shimon who were married to two sisters, and Reuven and Shimon died without children, then you've got Levi and Yehuda doing Yibum, or should do Yibum, to Reuven's widow and Shimon's widow. Now, if Reuven's widow was an erva to Levi, then Reuven's widow is not Neifel Yibum to Levi, and therefore Levi can do Yibum to Shimon's widow. That's called Achoisa shehi Yevimta. If the sister of the erva is a Yavam. Now, obviously, two sisters cannot be tzoros to each other because one man cannot marry two sisters. But here you've got two brothers who married two sisters, and they were both Neifel Yibum. It's called Achos Zekukosoi, that there's an issa to do Yibum to the sister of somebody, of a woman who is also Neifel Yibum. It's some similarity to Achos Ishtoi because of the connection that Zika makes. And therefore, however, if one of the two sisters are an erva, then the other one, the achos of the erva, can do Yibum because it's not achos zukukosei, because Reuven's almona is not zokuk liyibum to Levi, and therefore Levi can do Yibum to the almona of Shimon. And therefore, Chaylet says, Oimis Yabemes, Levi can do Yibum or Chalitza to Shimon's wife. Continues the Mishnah to explain what we said before. Isser Mitzvah. What is the concept of an Isur mitzvah that we said in the Mishnah? This is Shniyos Medivrei Soifrim. It's a type of aroyos which min haTorah they are not osir, but the Chachomim said it's like a second stage erva, which the Chachomim said is osir, just in order to prevent chas v'shalom somebody transgressing a first degree erva, which is min haTorah. The Chachomim made a second degree of erva. Those are called Shniyos Medivrei Soifrim. It's only also midrabanon. Isur Kedusha, the other bracket called Isur Kedusha that the Mishnah said Choyletzes v'loy misyabemes, is actually talking about any chayvei lavin. If there's a lav that would restrict Reuven from doing Yibum to Shimon's wife, because Shimon's wife was one of the Chayvei Lavin, we'll soon see who they are, then this Chayvei Lavin cannot do Yibum to Reuven. However, they have to do Chalitza because the issue of being an Isser of Lavin is not strong enough to exempt this woman altogether from Yibum, and therefore at least they have to do Chalitza. What are some examples of Chayvei Lavin? Almona leKohen Gadol. A Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry a widow. So if the brother of a Kohen Gadol died without children, then his wife is now a widow. The surviving brother, the Kohen Gadol, if he would do Yibum and marry his deceased brother's wife, it would be a Kohen Gadol marrying a widow, and that's a Chayvei Lavin. Or a Grusha v'Chalutza leKohen Hedyot. In the case of this woman who has either been divorced before or Chalitza has been done to her before, to a Kohen Hedyot. Now, a Kohen Hedyot is not allowed to marry a Grusha v'Chalutza. But if he transgressed that and did marry a Grusha v'Chalutza, then we know that by Chayvei Lavin, the Kiddushin is Chal. It's called married, and now this brother, this Kohen Hedyot who married a Grusha v'Chalutza now died without children, and now this widow who happens to have in her records her being either a Grusha or Chalutza from a previous marriage, then the surviving brother, if he were, who is a Kohen obviously, if he were to do Yibum with this woman, then it would be Grusha v'Chalutza leKohen Hedyot, and that is also a lav. Or Mamzeres u'Nesino Yisrael. Any Yisrael is an lav, an Issa lo yisaseh, to marry a Mamzeres or a Nesino. So if a brother was married to a Mamzeres or Nesino, and then that brother passed away without children, then even though there's a mitzvah of Yibum, but since it's Mamzeres or Nesino Yisrael, it's included in Isser Kedusha, which means that Yibum is not allowed to be done, however Chalitza has to be done. Or Bas Yisrael Nosin or Mamzer, if the surviving brother is either a Nosin or a Mamzer, and the woman who was married to the brother is a regular kosher Bas Yisrael, there's an Iselav for her to do Yibum to this Nosin or Mamzer, and therefore they have to do Chalitza and not Yibum. Says the Mishnah, says the Gemara. Klal, the first word in the Mishnah was Klal. There's a rule by Yibum that kol she'is erva lo chiletzes v'lo misyabemes. The question is, why are you making a whole rule out of this? Like, what's the issue? What are you coming to include? We've already learnt about this extensively. You're obviously coming to include something to impress on us a halacha that we may not necessarily have thought of otherwise. La'asuye mai, what are you coming to include? Answers the Gemara, Omara from Barpotpa, La'asuye tzoras ailunis, ukter Ravasi. We've already learnt about this on Daf Yud Beis, that according to Rav Asi, what is an ailunis? An ailunis is a woman who cannot have children. So if somebody was married to an ailunis, and then this somebody died without children, then there would be no reason, at first glance, there would be no reason for a surviving brother to do Yibum. However, since it says in the Pasuk Asher Teled that the concept of Yibum applies to a woman who can have children, and this woman cannot have children, then the Torah excluded her from Yibum. And if the Torah excluded her from Yibum, then doing Yibum would be the serious issa of Eishes Ach, of marrying the wife of a brother. Normally, every Yibum is Eishes Ach, but that's when the Torah allows it. Here the Torah doesn't give permission to do Yibum, so the issa of Eishes Ach comes back. Says Rav Asi that not only the ailunis that you cannot do Yibum with, but even the Tzoras ailunis, because this ailunis is considered an erva of issa Eishes Ach, because she cannot do Yibum, because she cannot have children. So according to Rav Asi, one of the examples of that an Issa Erva, that even the Tzara is loy chiletzes v'loy misyabemes, is this Tzoras ailunis, and that is what the Mishnah is coming to impress on us, that the Mishnah is following Rav Asi. Ve'iked Amra, others say no, that what the Mishnah is coming to impress on us with this rule is actually to exclude something, not to include something. That only kol she'isura issa erva, only when there's an issue of erva, huda asira tzarasa, then we say that the tzara is asar to do yibum with the surviving with that surviving brother. Ha lo yisura issa erva. However, if the issue is not arayis, then tzarasa lo asira. If there's a different issue we'll soon see what it is. If there's a different issue which is stopping Reuven doing Yibum with Shimon's wife, and it's not an erva issue, if it's not an erva issue, then the Reuven must do Yibum with the Tzara, with the other wife of Shimon. Limu'utemai. What's this? What would this be coming to exclude? Omara from Limute Tzaras Eilenes. If you've got a case where the only reason that Reuven cannot marry this wife of Shimon is because this wife of Shimon cannot have children, and it says Me'asher Teleid, that's only as far as the Eilenes is concerned. But this is only because there's an issue with her and her ability to have children. It's not because of erva. Since it's not because of erva, then Reuven is allowed to do Yibum with another wife of Shimon, not the Eilenis. So Tzoras Eilenis is mutter, udelaik Ravasi, and not like Ravasi, and that's what the Mishnah is coming to impress on us. Continues the Gemara. We saw in the Mishnah that if Reuven and Shimon are married to two sisters, Reuven and Shimon are two brothers married to two sisters. Reuven and Shimon both die without children, and now Levi and Yehuda have a mitzvah to do Yibum would have a mitzvah to do Yibum with Reuven and Shimon's wives. However, since both wives are nofal leyibum, or in the event that both wives are nofal leyibum to Levi and Yehuda, then both of those Yevamos are called Achois Zekukosoi. They're not tzoros because they were not married to the same husband, but it's a sister of somebody Zakuk leyibum, and to do Yibum with somebody who's Achois Zekukosoi is osar. However, if one of the two sisters is not Zakuk Yibum to Levi, if Reuven's wife has an issue and therefore is not in the bracket of Yibum to Levi, then Levi can do Yibum to Shimon's wife, because Shimon's wife is not Achois Zekukosei, because the other wife, Reuven's wife, is not Zakuk Yibum. So the question is, what is the issue between Reuven's wife and Levi that would say that Reuven's wife is not nofal yibum to Levi, and therefore Shimon's wife is not achois zekukosoi, and therefore Levi can do yibum to Shimon's wife? What case would that be? Achois deman, because the Mishnah mentioned a few cases. The Mishnah spoke about the issa erva, which is a type of issue which is aroyos, krisis, which is very serious. So are we talking about that Reuven's wife was an erva to Levi, and therefore she's not nofal yibum, and therefore Levi can do yibum to Shimon's wife? Or no, maybe it's talking about one of that the Reuven's wife was an issa of shniyos, for example, an issa d'Rabbanon to Levi, and then we'll say that since she cannot do yibum to Levi, Levi can do yibum to Shimon's wife. The Gemara is going to discuss that. Achoisa deman, the Shimon's wife, who is the sister of Reuven's wife, who's an issue, and Shimon's wife therefore can do Yibum to Levi, what's the status of her sister, namely Reuven's wife, relative to Levi? Ilema de Isser Mitzvah, are you going to say it's talking about that Reuven's wife to Levi was a chayve, was an Isser Mitzvah, which is an Issa d'Rabbanon, Shniyos Midivrei Seifrim, as we saw, that Issa Mitzvah is Shniyos Midivrei Seifrim, is only Midrabbanon, then we don't understand that. Given the Midairaisa Ramya Kamei, if Reuven's wife is only an Issa d'Rabbanon to Levi, that means that Min HaTorah, Reuven's wife is Neufel Yibum and Zokuk Yibum to Levi. And therefore, Shimon's wife is an Achois Zukukosoi to Levi. So how can the Mishnah say that Levi can do Yibum to Shimon's wife? He's going to be meeting an Achois Zukukosoi, which is Asr. Answers the Gemara, Elo Achoisa de Isser Erva. We're obviously talking about that the issue between Reuven's widow and Levi is a proper Erva. It's one of the krisis mentioned in the Mishnah on Daf Beis. And therefore, Reuven's wife is not Zokuk Yibum at all to Levi, and therefore Levi can do Yibum to Shimon's wife, and it's not considered Achois Zukukosoi. Continues the Gemara. Isur Mitzvah is Shniyos. We saw in the Brisa that Isur Mitzvah is Chiletzes v'lo misyabemes. What is Isur Mitzvah? Said the Mishnah, Shniyos midivrei Seifrim. There are certain aroyas that are Osir midirabonon, and even though they're also to do Yibum midirabonon to these aroyas, however, we cannot exempt them from the whole content and context of Yibum minatayra, and therefore we have to do Chalitza, and the Mishnah says, Chiletzes v'lo misyabemes. So asks the Gemara, Amai korile isur mitzvah. Why do you call these isurim derabonon an isur mitzvah? Interesting name to give aroyos midrabonon isur mitzvah. Omar Abaya, yes, because there's a special mitzvah to heed and listen to the words of the Chachomim, mitzvah lishmoya divrei Chachomim, and therefore to impress on us that it's a mitzvah to listen to the Rabbanons, therefore it's called Isur Mitzvah. Says the Gemara, Isur Kedusha. When the Mishnah said that Isur Kedusha also chiletzes v'lo misyabemes, the Mishnah said it's almona l'kohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot, etc. It's chayvei lavin. Amai korilei Isur Kedusha. Why are chayvei lavin considered, or why are these chayvei lavin of almona l'kohen gadol and grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot, why are they called Isur Kedusha? Answers the Gemara, because when it comes to the Isurim that apply exclusively to Kohanim, it says regarding the Kohanim, Kedoshim yu le'Eloheihem v'lo yichalelu shem Eloheihem ki as ishe Hashem lechem Eloheihem heim makrivim v'hoyu kodesh. Kohanim, the special mitzvahs and limitations and restrictions that Kohanim have are because of their Kedusha, and therefore the Almona l'Kohen Gadol and Grusha v'Chalutza l'Kohen Hedyot is considered Isur Kedusha. Continues the Gemara, Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Machlif. Rabbi Yehuda actually had an opposite version, that it's true that Isur Mitzvah and Isur Kedusha are chiletzes v'lo misyabemes, but when the Mishnah says that Isur Mitzvah is the Shniyos Medivrei Seifrim and Isur Kedusha is chayvei lavin, Rabbi Yehuda says the opposite. Isur Mitzvah, what's Isur Mitzvah? The chayvei lavin that we mentioned, almona l'kohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot. V'amai korile Isur Mitzvah. The Mishnah said that Isur Mitzvah is derabonons because mitzvah lishmei l'divrei chachomim, as we saw before. But if, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that the mitzvah is talking about chayvei lavin of almona l'kohen gadol and grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot, why are you calling that mitzvah? Answers the Gemara Dechsiv, because it says in the Pasuk, also in the context of the Kohanim, Eileh mitzvahs hashetziva Hashem es Moshe el bnei Yisrael b'Har Sinai, and this incorporates all the mitzvahs, restrictions, limitations of the Kohanim, and it's called Eileh HaMitzvahs. These are the mitzvahs. They have a special title, a special bracket of mitzvahs, and therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Isurim of the Kohanim, the Lavim of the Kohanim, Almona l'Kohen Gadol, Grusha v'Chalutza l'Kohen Hedyot, are called Isur Mitzvah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Isur Kedusha is Shniyos Medivrei Seifrim, that the Isurim derabonon, the Aroyos derabonon are considered Isur Kedusha. V'amai korele Isur Kedusha, why would they be given that title? Omar Abaya answers Abaya, Kol ha'mekayim divrei Chachomim nikra kodesh. Abaya says that anybody who heeds to the words of the Chachomim is considered a kodesh. Omale Rava questioned Abaya. It seems that listening to the Chachomim is a virtue, is something which gets a special title, a special praise. Somebody who doesn't listen to the sages, to the Chachomim, is it just that Kodesh hu d'lo mikri? Is he just losing the title of being holy and being Kodesh? Rosha nami lo mikri? Are you suggesting that he's not called a Rosha, a wicked person? Somebody who doesn't listen to the Chachomim is a bad person. Elo Omar Rava gives a different explanation why these Isurim derabonon, the Aroyos derabonon, are called Isur Kedusha, because it says Kaddish atzmecha b'mutalach. One of the concepts of Kedusha is to refrain even from those things that would have been permitted, and therefore these Isurim derabonon that min haTorah are permitted, and it's the Chachomim added on for the reasons that the Chachomim understood. They added on an extra protection, extra prohibitions and restrictions. That's called added Kedusha, and that's why it's called Isur Kedusha. Continues the Gemara. Almona l'Kohen Gadol. One of the examples of a chayvei lavin was Almona l'Kohen Gadol. That was one of the examples where it's, according to our Mishnah, it's called Isur Kedusha, and is chiletzes v'lo misyabemes, you cannot do yibum. Says the Mishnah, Kaposik v'toni. The Mishnah just made a very, very broad statement that any almona, any widow to a Kohen Gadol, you cannot do yibum. Lo yishna min hanisuin, irrespective of whether this widow, that means if Reuven is the Kohen Gadol and Shimon died without children, so it doesn't matter if Shimon was nisuin, and we've mentioned this before, that in Shas and in Torah, the getting married has two stages, Kiddushin and nisuin, not to be confused with what we call today an engagement and a marriage. The marriage itself has 2 stages, and we're going to learn more about this later on in Shas. And so, irrespective of whether the Shimon was married to his wife, min anisuin, which means a complete marriage, and then he died, and this almona is now also to Reuven, who's a Kohen Gadol, lo ishno min ha'erusin. But even if Shimon was only married to his wife on the level of arusa, of kiddushin, and then he died without children, even then the Kohen Gadol, the surviving brother Reuven, is not allowed to do yibum with the almona. And the Gemara is trying to understand this. Bishleima min nisuin, regarding in almona min hanisuin, we can understand why Reuven cannot do yibum, because the mitzvah of doing yibum is a mitzvah saseh, yivama yavei oleh. The iser of a Kohen Gadol to marry a grusha is aseh v'lo aseh, is also an aseh and also a lo aseh. There's an lo aseh of almona lo yikach, and there's an issa aseh where it says isha bivsuleh yikach, that a Kohen Gadol is only allowed to marry a girl that's never been married, that's a virgin. So that's an aseh v'lo aseh. Ve'ein aseh doicha lo aseh v'aseh. And we know that a mitzvah lo aseh cannot override a lo aseh v'aseh. So a Kohen Gadol to marry an almona min hanisuin, we can understand why you cannot do yibum. Elo min ha'erusin. But if Shimon was only married to his wife, min ha'erusin, only did kiddushin, then lo yisaseh gereidahu. Then, since nisuin hasn't been done, we assume that she's still a basula. So the mitzvah, the isaseh of isha b'vsuleh o yikach wouldn't apply. It would only be the lo yisaseh of almona lo yikach. And if we've got a mitzvah saseh of yibum, yivama yavei eleh, and the lo yisaseh of almona lo yikach, yavei aseh v'yitche lo yisaseh, why don't we use the old rule, the good rule that we always know of aseh doicha lo yisaseh, to say that min ha'Torah, let this Kohen Gadol do yibum? Why does the Mishnah say that any almona lo Kohen Gadol cannot do yibum? Answers the Gemara, and the Gemara is going to have a number of different suggestions why chayvei lavin cannot do yibum. They do chalitza, but they cannot do yibum. Omar of Gidl, Omar Rav. Said in the name of Rav, Omar Kro, because it says in the pasuk as follows. It's talking about chalitza. It says there, V'im lo yach b'itzoish. If the yavam does not desire, lo kacha, says yuvimtoi, to take, to acquire, to marry this yuvimtoi, the woman, the yuvama, also Yevimtoi Hashara, then Yevimtoi, this woman who's Zokuk Liyibum, goes Hashara El Azkenim, to the gates, to the Beis Din, Va'omra, and she says, Me'ein Yevami Lahokim La'ochiv Shem B'Yisrael, that this Yavam, the surviving brother, doesn't want to marry me in order to be able to build his deceased brother's name. He doesn't want to do yibum to me. So, but if you notice at the beginning of the pasuk, it says, if this man, the Yavam, chooses not to do yibum, then also yivimtoi hashara. Why do you have to mention yivimtoi again? It should just say also hashara, and she goes up to the chachomim, to the zakenim. What's the extra word yivimtoi? Says the Gemara, says Rav, Omer Krava also yuvimtoi ashara. She'ein Talmud leima yuvimtoi. We don't need the extra word yuvimtoi because it already says lo kacha, says yuvimtoi. That im lo yach b'tzoish lo kacha, says yuvimtoi. Ma Talmud leima yuvimtoi, to tell us that yesh lecha yavomo achas she'oilo lechalitza ve'eino oilo leyibum. Because it's true that ve'im lo yach b'tzoish lo kacha, says yuvimtoi, that if a person chooses not to do yibum, he has to do chalitza. But then there's another type of yavoma, also yivimtoi ashar, another type of yavoma, and this is a type of yavoma that couldn't do yibum, and nonetheless also yivimtoi ashara, and does chalitza. That means that the fact that we mentioned twice yivimtoi is telling us there's 2 different brackets of yavomis that both do chalitza. There's one type of yavomis who do chalitza because the husband, the yavam, chooses not to do yibum, and there's another one where she cannot do yibum because she's not allowed to do yibum with him, which is the chayvei lavin. That yesh lecha yavama achas she'oilo lechalitza ve'eino oilo leyibum ve'ezuzu. And what type of yavama is this? Chayvei lavin. So it's as if we have a pasuk that tells us that chayvei lavin do not do yibum, they do chalitza. And now the Gemara asks, ve'ema chayvei krisis. Once you have a pasuk that says that there's a concept of having of chalitza in a case where you couldn't really do Yibum, then what makes you think it's just by Chayve Lavim? Maybe it's even by Krisis, that even though you cannot do Yibum, you still have to do Chalitza. And we learned in the Mishnah that by the Chayve Krisis, at the beginning of the first parak, the Chayve Krisis, the Erva, there's no Yibum or Chalitza. Answers the Gemara, no, because there's a certain Yesoid, a certain foundation that we learn from the beginning of this pasuk. Omer Kra, we read the beginning of the pasuk where it says, Im lo yachpo ish lo kachases yevimtoi. That when does this pasuk, which is chalitza, apply? If the yavam chooses not to desire, or he chooses not to do yibum with this woman. Ha chofetz miyabim, but it seems that he has it within his hands to do yibum. And what do we learn from there? That kol ha'oile le'yibum oile le'chalitza. That the concept of chalitza only applies when the concept of yibum would have some place. But b'chol she'ein oile le'yibum, but something like chorus, where the concept of yibum doesn't apply, ein oile le'chalitza, then chalitza wouldn't apply either. Says the Gemara, if you have such a rule, then ihacha chayve lavin nami. Then learn from the beginning of the pasuk that chayve lavin, where you cannot do Yibum, because there's a Chayve Lav, there's a Loisaseh to do Yibum, then you do not do Chalitza either. And how can the Mishnah we just learned here say that Choyletzes v'lo misyabemes? Says the Gemara, Horob Yerachmona Yuvimtoi. But did we not just learn from the extra word Yuvimtoi that there is a case where you do Chalitza where there's no place of doing Yibum? So from there we see that the Chayve Lavin, even though you cannot do Yibum, you do Chalitza. Says the Gemara, Umaro Isa. Why are you choosing this way around? From a rule that you established from the beginning of the pasuk, you're saying that only where there's Yibum, there's Chalitza. From the extra word Yuvimto, you're telling us that even where there's no Yibum, there's Chalitza. Why are you saying that Chayve Krisis, that's where we use the rule of the beginning of the pasuk? No Yibum, no Chalitza. The Chayve Lavin, that's when you say, even though there's no Yibum, there's Chalitza. What would make you do that? Says the Gemara, Mistabra, it's logical. That Chayve Lavin, we know that generally Chayve Lavin, Tofsibu Kiddushin, that if even though somebody's not allowed to, it's an Aveira to marry a Chayve Lavin, but if he does marry, the marriage is valid and he has to give a get. However, Chayve Krisis, Lo Tofsibu Kiddushin. If somebody marries a woman who is an erva of Koros, the Kiddushin is not valid at all. So we assume that in the case where Kiddushin would be valid, in that case there is Chalitza. But in a case where the Kiddushin would not be valid, then there's also no Chalitza. Mosiv Rava. Now Rava is asking a question on this. Isur mitzvah ve'isur kedusha. What happens in the case where it's either an Isur mitzvah or Isur kedusha? As we learned, Isur mitzvah are the Shniyos Midivrei Seifrim, Isur kedusha are the Chayve Lavin. What happens if Bo'oleo or Cholatzlo? What happens if one of the brothers actually had relations with her, or did Chalitza with an Isur mitzvah or an Isur kedusha? Because what does it say in our Mishnah? The halacha is an Isur mitzvah, Isur kedusha. The halacha is to do Chalitza, not Yibum. If this Yavam either did Yibum or Chalitza, then it's valid, and Niftara Tzarasa. The Tzara has now exempted, because we know that if Shimon dies without children, then one of his wives have to do Yibum or Chalitza. And over here, this Isur Mitzvah, Isur Kedusha, should not have been chosen to do Yibum. She could have been chosen to do Chalitza, but certainly not Yibum. And therefore, the other tzara, the other wife, one should have done with her Yibum or Chalitza rather than doing Yibum with an Isur Mitzvah, it's a Chalitza. So the Gemara is saying, Isal Kadaitach, Chayve Lavin Mida'iraisa Lechalitza Ramya, according to what we said before, where we said, Rav Gidl said in the name of Rav, that from the extra word Yuvimtoi, we have a pasuk that tells us that there's no Yibum, but there is Chalitza. There's a type of Yibum where you cannot do Yibum, the Lo Yachpoi Tzu'ish Lo Kachas Yuvimtoi doesn't apply, nonetheless there's Chalitza. So if you have an explicit pasuk telling us that you cannot do Yibum by Chayve Lavin, you only do Chalitza, then doing Yibum will not be valid. If you'll entertain this idea that you said now in the name of Rav, that Chayve Lavin Mida'iraisa Lechalitza Ramya Le Yibum Loy Ramya, If he did Yibum when it was Chayvei Lavin, Amay Niftarat Tzarasa, why is that Yibum valid if the Torah says you should not do Yibum? It's as if you didn't do Yibum. It's as if nothing was done. If nothing was done, then the rival wife, the other wife, is still in the bracket of a Yevama, and one has to do Yibum or Chalitza with her. Says the Gemara, Hu Moisiv Lo V'hu Mefarik Lo. The same Rava who asked the question from this Brisa is also giving the answer. Litstodim Ktoni. You actually have to separate the phraseology here. You have to cut it into two and read it as if it's on two sides, as follows. Ba'aleo, if he did Yibum with the Chayvei Lavin, if he did Yibum, with this, because how's the Brisa start? Isser mitzvah, v'isser kedusha, ba'aleo, oichol atzlo, niftarot tzarasa. Says no. If this that it says that ba'aleo, they actually did Yibum with her, that's only referring to the Isser mitzvah. The Isser mitzvah is when it's an Isser d'Rabbanon, Shniyos Medivrei Seifrim. If it's Shniyos Medivrei Seifrim, it's only Midrabbanon that he shouldn't do Yibum, but the Yibum is valid, and therefore the Torah is Potur. Cholatzlo, however, when it speaks about doing Chalitza, there are Isser Kedusha. It could be going even on the Isser Kedusha, even on the Chayvei Lavin, where regarding the Chayvei Lavin, Yibum would not be valid, according to our understanding now, because we have a pasuk that you don't do Yibum by Chayvei Lavim, but Chalitza you still have to do. And therefore, Cholatzla is a Kedusha. When you have a Chayvei Lavin and you did Chalitza, indeed the Chalitza works and exempts all the other tzoris from the Zika, from Yibum and Chalitza. Continues the Gemara, another question. Mosiv Rova, Patsua Daka, Uchrus Shavcha, or Soris Adam, and we're going to learn about these things later on in the Masechta, on Daf Ayin Tes, but these are three different people who they cannot have children, and they're not actually, there's actually a lav for them to get married to a regular woman. Or Vahazokin, or somebody who's very old and cannot have children. In these cases, Oy Choltzin, Oy Meyabmin. Then Chalitza or Yibum could apply. Regarding the Zokin, the old person, he can even do Yibum L'Katchila. Regarding the P'tzua Daka, Krus Shavcha, and Sris Adam, which it's Chayvei Lavin, but if he did Yibum, the Yibum works. B'diavad. Says the Brisa, Ketzad. Let's try and understand this. And regarding these three people, the P'tzua Daka, the Krus Shavcha, and the Sris Adam, or this group of four, including the Zokin, there's always, they can come into a picture on two fronts. Either that the Shimon who died without children, he was in this bracket, and now Reuven, who's not in this bracket, is now contemplating whether he has to do Yibum or Chalitza with the widow of Shimon, or the other way around. Shimon who died was a normal, young, healthy person, and it's Reuven who has to do Yibum that falls in this bracket. Does he do Yibum or not? So the Brisa is going to split up. Ketzad says, Meisu, if one of these people, a P'tzua Daka, or Krus Shavcha, or Sris Adam, if they died without children, it was Shimon that was suffering from these conditions. Velohem Achim, and they had brothers, for example, Reuven, and Reuven was a young, healthy person. Velohem Nashim, and this Reuven happened to have other wives as well, which is okay. Ve'omdu Achin, and one of the other brothers, which were well and healthy, Osu Mamar B'Neshesem, they did a Kiddushin, which is called, it's a Kinyan Midirabonon, it's Kiddushin on a Yevama. It's a concept we'll learn later on of Mamar, where even though Yibum has to be getting married, it's not just doing a Kiddushin. Kiddushin doesn't really suffice, but Midirabonon, Kiddushin has some value even between a Yavam and a Yevama. So if one of these other brothers did Mamar to the wife of this P'tzua Daka, Krus Shavcha, etc., or V'nosnu get, or instead of doing Chalitza, they gave a get to this Yevama, or V'choltzu, or if they did Chalitza to this Yevama, Ma she'asu asu, whatever they did is valid. V'im boalu, and if they actually married them, had relations with them, and it's what we call they did Yibum with them, konu, then this woman is considered a wife, and he cannot terminate that relationship without a get. Meisu, that's the first part of the Brisa. Next part of the Brisa is not that the person who died, Shimon, who was one of these three. Rather, Meisu Achim. rather there was a healthy, normal brother who died. V'omdu heim, and one of these three, a surviving brother who was a p'tzuadaka, krus shavchos, ris odom, etc. And this p'tzuadaka, v'osu mamar, b'neshesem, did a kiddushay d'Rabbanon on the Yevamah that the widow of Shimon, or v'nosnu get, or gave the widow of Shimon a divorce, instead of doing chalitza, or shecholzu, or did chalitza. Here too, masha osa osu. It's valid. V'im bo'alu, but if this krus shavcha actually did a regular yibum, kanu, then the yibum is valid. However, v'osu l'kaimon, you can't stay married because this person, this yavam, is a krus shavcha, p'tzuadaka, a sris odom, and there's a lav. Mishum shenemar, it says in the pasuk, lo yavoi p'tzuadaka. The pasuk says that you're not allowed to marry lo yavoi p'tzuadaka krus shavcha b'kal Hashem. It's a marriage which is a lav. So here you've got a case where you've got the yavam. This yavam himself, the surviving brother, was a p'tzuadaka or krus shavcha or sris odom, and it's in the bracket of a chayve lavin, and it says v'im kon im bo'alu konu. If they did yibum, it's valid. So this is the end of the brisa. So Rav is now asking, v'isal kedaito chayve lavin midoraisa. If, like you, Rav Gidl said in the name of Rav, that we learn from a pasuk that by chayve lavin minatayra lechalitza ramya leyibum lo ramya, minatayra you have to do chalitza and not do yibum. Im bo'alu amay konu. If this p'tzuadaka does yibum, why is the yibum valid? Ela omar Rava. Rava's got a different explanation as to why chayve lavin do not do yibum. Because we saw, how did we start this? That the Mishnah brings an example of the chayve lavin is almona l'kohen gadol. Almona l'kohen gadol. In the event that it's almona mino erosin, that the Shimon who passed away was only done kiddushin with this woman, then there's only a lav. And the Gemara said you should say aseh doichalois aseh. Why do you not do yibum in that case? So Rav Gidl said in the name of Rav that we have a pasuk, but Rav refuted that and said it cannot be there's a pasuk that says that chayve lavin don't do yibum, because if there would be a pasuk, we would have a problem with the brisa that Rav asked from. So Rodid Rav say Amar Rav almona mina erusin. This almona mina erusin nami asei v'lo yisasehu. Is no difference between the almona mina erusin and almona mina nisuin. And the reason you don't do yibum is not because it's asei deich. There's nothing to do with asei deich lo yisaseh. The reason you don't do yibum is because it's not just a lo yisaseh, it's an asei and a lo yisaseh. And an asei does not override a lo yisaseh v'asei. In the same way as we understood that kohen gadol to a nesua, to an almona from nisuin, is we understand that there's no yibum because there's also lav, also an asay, even erusin, even though you do not have the asay that we mentioned of that he's of isha b'psuleho yikoch, because she is a basula, because it's only mina erusin, not mina nisuin, but there's another asay. Almona mina erusin nami asay v'lo yisasehu. T'chsev, because it says in the pasuk by the koyanim, kedoshim yiu leloheim v'lo yechalelu shem eloheim kes ishe Hashem lechem eloheim him akrivim v'hayu kodesh. We saw this pasuk before on Amud Aleph that regarding the koyanim, all the restrictions of a koyanim have an added asay of kedoshim yiu leloheim. Says the Gemara, okay, I now understand why the Mishnah says that almona l'kohen gadol is, and for that matter, grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot. I understand why they don't do yibum, because it's yibum is just a mitzvah saseh, yavam yoleo. A kohen marrying somebody he's not allowed to is a lo saseh and an aseh. Ein aseh doicha lo saseh v'aseh. You cannot do yibum. However, you still have to do chalitza. Okay. However, mamzeres unasina. The Mishnah carried on. The Mishnah, in the examples the Mishnah brought of Issa Kedusha, it says almona l'kohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot, mamzeres unasina liyisrael, ubas Yisrael unasin v'mamzer, that they also are chiletzes v'lo misyabemes. Why do they not do yibum? It's only allowed that to marry a mamzeres or a nasina. Why don't you say asay doicha lo yisaseh? Answers the Gemara, Ksiv because there's a pasuk there as well. The pasuk says, Ki ani Hashem Elokeichem, v'hiskadashtem v'yisem kedoshim ki kodesh oni, v'loisetamu es nafsheseichem b'chol asher etzorim es halaretz. And in that parasha, where these halachas apply, we find an extra mitzvah of kedusha, and since there's kedusha, since a Klal Yisrael are required to have extra kedusha and to stay away from these averus, therefore mamzer and nesino is not only a lav, it's also an asay. Says the Gemara, if so, the same Viskadashtem we just learned now, that Klal Yisrael are required to be holy, then that would also tell us that every single loisaseh in the Torah, that refraining from transgressing it is an element of Kedusha. So you'll never ever have a case of Aseh Doicha Loisaseh, because every single Loisaseh is an Aseh and a Loisaseh, and Ein Aseh Doicha Loisaseh v'Aseh. Answers the Gemara. Ela Omar Rava is giving a different explanation why you do not do Yibum with an Almona L'Kohen Gadol Ba'erusin, not because there's a Pasuk, and not because it's a Loisaseh and an Aseh. No. Really, it's just a regular Loisaseh. And you should do Yibum because Aseh Doicha Loisaseh. However, there's a Gzeira. Ela Omar Rava Gzeira Almona Min Ha'erusin or to Almona Min Ha'nesuin. Because if you're going to allow an Almona Min Ha'erusin to do Yibum, then maybe by mistake they'll do Yibum even if it's an Almona Min Ha'nesuin. Almona Min Ha'nesuin cannot do Yibum because Ein Aseh Doicha Loisaseh v'Aseh. So to make sure that that mistake doesn't happen, the Chachamim said, do Chalitza, do not do Yibum. Says the Gemara, okay, so you've explained Almona L'Kohen Gadol. What's with Mamzeres Unasina? Ma'ikeh L'Meimer. Over there, what if really allow a Yibum by Loisaseh, you should do Yibum, because Aseh Doicha Loisaseh. Just Almona Min Ha'erusin, or to Almona Min Ha'nesuin, you don't do Yibum. So why Mamzeres can you not do Yibum? Let the Aseh of Yibum override the Loisaseh of Mamzeres, Unasina, Ma'ikeh L'Meimer. Answers the Gemara, there also there's a Gzeira. Gzeira, b'mokim mitzvah, otu shaloi b'mkoim mitzvah. If you're going to allow this Yovam to marry a Mamzeres, he might say, if you're allowed to marry Mamzeres, I can always marry a Mamzeres. And you won't pay attention to the fact that you're only allowed to marry the Mamzeres in the context of Yibum, because it's a mitzvah, and Aseh Doicha Loisaseh, not in the context of Yibum, you wouldn't be allowed to. Elo me'ato. Says the Gemara, once you're making these types of Gzeiras, Eishes Ochiv Me'oviv, a regular case of Yibum, which is a brother's wife, but it's got to be a brother from the same father. The Yovam and the Mace have to share the same father. And that is Yibum. But the Gemara is saying, maybe say, no such thing as Yibum. Loitis Yabim, Gzeira Mishum Eishes Achiv Me'imai. Because people will get confused and say that if you do Yibum when a brother sharing the same father dies without children, maybe you do Yibum when a brother with the same mother, not with the same father, dies. You also do Yibum. And that's certainly not true. So maybe in order to avoid such a mistake, you shouldn't allow Yibum at all. Says the Gemara, no. Yibum benachla tolarachmona. The Pasuk makes it very clear that the type of brothers that you are in the parasha of Yibum, that you do Yibum with, are only those that you would inherit, which is brothers from the same father. And therefore, and everybody knows, Meida Yediyah, nobody will make a mistake. Everybody knows that Yibum is only when the deceased and the surviving brother share the same father, not if they just share the same mother. Says the Gemara, okay, Isha sheyesh lo bonim, but how about every Yibum is a woman who doesn't have children? If a man, if the husband doesn't have children, then there's Yibum. But what happens if the man did have children? Then of course there's no Yibum. That's a regular Ishasach. It's Chiv Korus. Asks the Gemara, if you're saying that because of Gezeiras you don't do Yibum, Isha she'ein lo bonim loitis yabim, you shouldn't let a woman who didn't have children do Yibum, Gezeira mishum Isha she'esh lo bonim. People might get confused and say that in the same way as you do Yibum with this woman who didn't have children, maybe you can do Yibum also with somebody who did have children. Says the Gemara, no. But bonim tolar achmona. The Pasuk says explicitly, the Yibum is only when he doesn't have children. And therefore everybody knows, nobody will get confused. Says the Gemara, okay, but there's a case where people might, yes, get confused. A regular Yibum, we've already learnt about this previously, that the brother who died and the brother who survived have to have been alive at the same time. If the brother who survived was born after the brother who died, then it's called Eishes Achiv Shelo Hoya Ba'ilamai. So the question is that an Eishes Achiv Shehaya Ba'ilamai, a regular Yibum, Loitis Yabim, should not be allowed. Gezeira Mishum Eishes Achiv Shelo Hoya Ba'ilamai. People might get confused and say, in the same way as Reuven can do Yibum with Shimon, then in the same way as Reuven does Yibum when he was alive at the same time as Shimon, maybe he can also do Yibum if he would have been born after Shimon died. And that's not true. Says the Gemara, "B'yeshiva tala rachmana meidiyadiyah." It says explicitly in the pasuk Yeshu achim yachtov that it's almost explicit in the pasuk that Yibum is only when the two brothers were alive at the same time, and therefore everybody knows. Says the Gemara, "Kol anoshim lo tisyab mena gezeir mishum eilunis." We know that an eilunis is not allowed to do Yibum because an eilunis cannot have children, and it says asher teleid. So say that people might think, in the same way as you can do Yibum with a regular widow, maybe you can do Yibum with an eilunis, and that's not true. So therefore, don't let anybody do Yibum lest they get confused. Says the Gemara, lo yishchicha. Eilunis, such a woman who cannot have children, is very rare, and therefore we don't need to worry that people are going to make that mistake. Says the Gemara, mamzeres u'nesina nami lo yishchicha. Why are you saying that mamzeres and nesina you're not allowed to do Yibum? And the Gemara explained before that why do we not let any mamzeres u'nesina do Yibum, even though would be an asay doichalois aseh, is because people will get confused and say that even a mamzeres and a sina shaloibim koi mitzvah you can also marry. But mamzeres and a sina is very not shchiach. It's not common, and therefore why should we say that we're afraid it'll get confused with mamzeres and a sina shaloibim koi mitzvah if it's not shchiach? And therefore you should allow in b'mokim mitzvah where you have asay doichalois aseh, you should allow yibum by mamzeres and a sina. Elo Amar Rava. Rabbi is saying, no, I'll give you a different explanation why by Chayve Lavin there's no Yibum. It's not because of the Gzeira. Elo Marova, Gzeira Bia Rishoina Oto Bia Shnia. Because the whole mitzvah of Yibum is getting married to the Yavama, not staying married to the Yavama. Once you've done the mitzvah and you've done the Bia Rishoina, you've had the first time relations with this woman, you've done the mitzvah of Yibum. But now how can you continue? You can't continue living with her. And therefore, by Chayve Lavin, where because of the Lav, you're not allowed to continue living with her, and therefore the Chachomim said don't do Yibum at all. Because people might say, in the same way as you can do Bia Rishoina, you can do Bia Shnia. Tanya Nam Yachi, there seems to be a brisa to this effect, where we said before, the brisa says, Im Boalu Konu, that if the Chayve Lavin actually did Yibum, and we saw this before in the brisa, that if the Chayve Lavin did Yibum, the Yibum is valid, but only B'Bia Rishoina. It's only valid that you've done Yibum. However, V'osu L'Kaimon B'Bia Shnia, you're not allowed to continue having relations with her because it's a Chayve Lavin. And therefore, Chayve Lavin do not do Yibum. Hoda Omar Rava, V'itei Ravashi. However, Rava, or possibly Ravashi, they actually changed their minds and said, Lav Miltzi. No, it's Lav Miltzi da Omri. It's not what the reason that Chayve Lavin don't do Yibum is not because Gzeira Bia Rishoina Otu Bia Shnia. No. Da Omar Shlokish, because Shlokish said explicitly, we're going to now prove that by Chayve Lavin, in this case of Yibum, Min HaTorah there's no Yibum. Because what have we been saying all along? There's Aseh Doichalois Aseh. No. Says Rav or Ravashi, that Rish Lakish is now going to introduce us to a concept in the halachos of Aseh Doichalois Aseh, that the whole concept of Aseh Doichalois Aseh doesn't apply to Yibum. If it doesn't apply to Yibum, then you've got the Lav, and the Aseh of Yibum doesn't override the Lav, and therefore we understand the Mishnah says Chayve Lavin is Choletzes v'lo misya bemes. Why? What does Rish Lakish say? What rule could there be in the guidelines of Aseh Doichalois Aseh that would exempt Yibum? Because Rish Lakish says, Kol mokim shata moitze aseh v'lo yisa aseh. In any case where you've got either doing the mitzvah, but doing the mitzvah means overriding a lo yisa aseh, im ata yochi lekayim shneim, if you can manage somehow to do the mitzvah without needing to override the aveira, mutav, that's what you should do. Ve'im lav, but only if there's no way of doing the mitzvah without transgressing the aveira, then yovoy aseh, the aseh will come v'yitzcha and override as lo yisa aseh, the lo yisa aseh. That's what Rish Lakish says. So what did Rav and Ravashi say? Hochanami, in our case of Yibum, efshe b'chalitza. Because in the parasha of Yibum it says you either do Yibum, which is marriage, or chalitza, which is a type of a divorce, from the connection, from the relationship. And since you can do it with chalitza, the mekayim aseh v'lo yisaseh. You've also managed to not transgress the issa of marrying Chayve Lavin, and you have also at the same time conformed with the guidelines of mitzvahs Yibum by doing chalitza instead of Yibum. There's no necessity to override the lo yisaseh, and therefore there's no Yibum b'Chayve Lavin. Asks the Gemara, if so, if min HaTorah there's no aseh doichalois aseh, that means because it's efshel lekayim shneim, then if you did yibum, it shouldn't be valid. Meisvei, the question is, in Bo'alu Konu, we saw in the Brisa before, that if the Chayvei Lavin did yibum, then the yibum is valid. Says the Gemara, Tiyufta, you're right. That Rav and Rav Ashi, they are refuted. Because it's even, we'll soon see what Rish Lakish is going to say about this, but the using Rish Lakish's guide as saying that by Yibum there's no Aseh Deichalois Aseh, that's clearly refuted from in Bo'alu Konu. From the Brisa that says in Bo'alu Konu, it's clear that the Yibum min ha-Torah, the Yibum works, and it's only a rabbinical issue that overrides and says, don't do Yibum, chiletzes v'lo misyabemes. Tiyufta, indeed, it's a refutation against Rava or Rav Ashi. Says the Gemara, Itmar, bias kohen gadol ba'almona. What happens if the brother of a kohen gadol died without children, and now the kohen gadol has the mitzvah of Yibum, but his deceased brother's widow is an almona, is a widow, and we said almona lekohen gadol is a lav, and the Mishnah says that issa kedusha you don't do yibum. So says the Gemara, bias kohen gadol ba'almona. If the kohen gadol did do bia, did marry and do yibum with this almona, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar, there was a machlekes. Chad Omar, one of the opinions are Eino poiteres tzarasa, that we totally disregard the yibum, the bias kohen gadol ba'almona. It's as if he hasn't done yibum, and therefore the tzara is still got a zika yibum, and you have to deal with the tzara. V'chad, the other opinion says poiteres tzarasa, that indeed the yibum was valid, and therefore the tzara, the other widow of Shimon who died, is now potter. She can marry whoever she wants. Not one of the brothers-in-laws, obviously, but there's no more issue with her. And ba'almona min anisuin, if this almona that the kohen gadol married and did yibum with was an almona that Shimon had done nisuin already, could almona pliki delay patra. Everybody agrees that the yibum is not being valid. And why? As we saw on Daf Yomi Shiur, that the mitzvah aseh of Yibum Yevama Yavo Eleo does not override the aseh and the lois aseh, the aseh of Isha B'Sula Yikach and the lois aseh of Almona Lo Yikach. It doesn't override it, and therefore min ha-Torah there's no validity to the Yibum. Ki pligi, where was Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar arguing? Ba'almona min ha'erusin, when it's just a chayvei lavin, where there's no aseh, as we've been discussing all along, when Shimon only did kiddushin and not nisuin, and then Shimon died, and Reuven the kohen gadol did yibum with her. Manda Omar Poiteres, the opinion who says that the tzara is potter, which means that the yibum was valid, holds osya aseh v'dochi lo aseh, and says that, and it's like we saw before in Bo'alu Konu, that the yibum is valid because on a biblical level the mitzvah aseh of yibum overrode the lo aseh of the almona min ha'erusin. However, man da'oma eino poteres, the opinion who says that we invalidate the yibum, even though it was only almona min ha'erusin, holds lo yasi aseh v'doicha as lo aseh. They hold, like we saw before, like Rava or Rav Ashi attempted to say, based on Rish Lakish, kiven de'efshe b'chalitza. Since you could do chalitza, if you could do chalitza, then there's no yibum. And since min ha-Torah there's no yibum, we disregard the yibum. And again, the question is, meisvei v'im Bo'alu Konu. We saw before the same question that we asked on Rav and Rav Ashi using Rish Lakish. We're asking again now on this itmar, on what we just learnt now. How can one of the opinions say that the yibum is not valid even when it's just min ha'erusin, it's an aseh doicha lo aseh? How can you say that the reason that it doesn't work is because it's efshel lekayim shneim? The Brisa explicitly says that it does work. Says the Gemara Tiyufta. Indeed, it's a refutation, and everybody agrees that by lavin, if he did yibum, the yibum is valid. So now the question is, so we've refuted Rava and Rav Ashi. Rish Lakish himself, leima teva tiyufta, teva nami tiyufta to Rish Lakish. Why can't we say from the very fact that we know, from the very fact that the Brisa says in Bo'alu Konu, that even though you've got a lav, and this is a lav of the Brisa was talking about, P'tzuadaka, well, Mono L'Kohen Gadol, you have the lavim, and it's explicit that the yibum works. How can the yibum work? Rish Lakish says that if it's efshel lekayim shneim, then you don't say aseh doicha lo yisaseh. And over here it's efshel lekayim shneim because you can do chalitza. So the very fact that the Brisa says that the Yibum does work is proof that even if efshel lekayim shneim, you still say aseh doicha lo yisaseh. Not like Rish Lakish. Says the Gemara, no. Rish Lakish will answer you as follows. Rava and Rav Ashi used my rule of efshel lekayim shneim, that when it's able to do the aseh and would not transgress the lo yisaseh, they used it in the context of Yibum. And there we have a question on that. We see Yibum is valid. Rish Lakish says, but I don't agree with that. Because Rish Lakish should say, when does my rule stand? That's only if you can actually fulfill the mitzvah without transgressing the Aveira. And Rav and Rav Ashi assumed that since you can do chalitza, then you can fulfill the mitzvah of the parsha of Yibum without transgressing the lo yisaseh. But Rish Lakish said, chalitza b'mokim Yibum lav mitzvahi. I say that chalitza is not instead of Yibum. The mitzvah is to do Yibum, not to do chalitza. It's true that if you don't do Yibum, you have to do chalitza. But the mitzvah is to do Yibum. And since the mitzvah is to do Yibum, the fact that you can do chalitza doesn't mean it's efshel lekayim shneim. And since it's not efshel lekayim shneim, you say aseh doicha lo yisaseh. And therefore, im ba'alu konu, and therefore, it's only Rav and Rav Ashi's application of Rish Lakish which has been refuted. Rish Lakish himself will say, I don't agree to use this rule of mine in the context of Yibum. And the context of Yibum, by Lavin, we say aseh doicha lo yisaseh, and min ha'Torah im ba'alu konu. Midrabanon, we saw in our Mishnah. Midrabanon, the halach is chayletzes v'lo misyabemes. You should do chalitza, you should not do Yibum. And in Mirz Hashem in the next shiur, we're going to continue from here.